Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Welcome to the side event on social value. Really looking forward to having the opportunity to spend some time talking to you about social value and also about BS 8950, which actually published a year ago this month. So it's a nice opportunity to talk about it again. And then hopefully take some questions. So just quick housekeeping. I believe you are all muted. However, we do have tech support here who can unmute you if you raise your hands. I will also monitor the chat, and I propose that you submit your questions in the chat box. There is a Q&A box, but I suggest that we use the chat box. So hopefully that works. And now on to the session. So we will be starting with Tom, who is here with us. Tom Levitt is a freelance consultant on responsible and sustainable business. He was part of the drafting team that created BS 8950, called Understanding and Enhancing Social Value, and wrote the separate guide to the standard, which has actually been made available to conference attendees. A former member of Parliament, Tom co-founded the award-winning social enterprise Fair for You. He's also got other publications, and his full biography is available on the conference information site. So I'm really pleased to hand over to Tom now, who will essentially talk about social value, and then I will introduce and spend a little bit more time afterwards talking about the standard. So over to you, Tom.
Well, thank you very much, Christina, and good morning, everybody. Yes, I was a member of Parliament up until 2010, and in 2010, at that same election, a new MP called Chris White got elected. And Chris had a private members bill which brought in, eventually became the Public Service Social Value Act. And it was a pretty unique bill, not least because it's quite unusual for a backbencher to be able to get a bill through Parliament. But Chris was very, very lucky because that was a particularly long Parliament. They normally only last 11 or 12 months. That one lasted 16, and he just managed to squeeze it in under the line. So it introduced the concept of social value to the world, if you like, without ever actually defining what it meant by social value. I think it's been quite convenient not to define it, but you can only do that for so long. And I'll come back to what exactly it might be a little bit later on. Now, the law, of course, insofar as that act is the law in England, at least, on social value, first of all, only applies to the public sector, to public sector procurement in particular. It only applies to contracts above a certain level, defined by reference to a European standard, which, of course, in this modern post-Brexit day and age, we're free to change that standard if we so wish. It's also voluntary. It doesn't oblige anyone to do anything, which doesn't seem to be the point of a law, some might say. And the amount of a contract tender which can be replaced, if you like, by or added to by adding social value was defined in law as up to 10% of the value of the contract. Now, various groups of people saw this bill as being, this act, as it was from 2012, as being particularly useful. It was useful to local authorities because they were the bulk of public sector organizations, because it allowed them to generate social good, however that's defined, within a community without actually spending any more money on it. They just made sure, or planned to make sure, that whoever was delivering contracts was delivering social value as well. This was particularly of interest to larger local authorities because many of the smaller local authorities, which turned out to be most, weren't operating with contracts over and above the threshold level. They were generally too small for the law to click in. But remember, the law was only a guide. Another group of people saw this as having great potential, and that was social enterprises, because they exist by definition to deliver social good, social value, over and above the value of any service which they are producing. And so they saw a real opportunity to say to local authorities, look, you can buy your goods and services off us because we, by definition, deliver social value. So putting all of those together, you had two quite happy groups of people, big local authorities and the world of social enterprise. Some of the bigger local authorities, in particular Birmingham, also Manchester and Croydon and several others in the 10 years since, have really made a point of using this act as far as they possibly can and maximizing the amount of social value, restricting how companies that don't deliver social value can deliver services on behalf of the local authority. And it has become mainstream. And yet we still don't know exactly what social value is if we're going to rely on the law to tell us. Interestingly, quite early on, the computer company Fujitsu announced that it was going to adopt the principles of the Social Value Act, and it wrote to all 1,700 of its SME suppliers in the UK and said, if you want to stay on our suppliers list, you need to be able to demonstrate that you are delivering social value. So I think it's about time that we had a think of what social value actually means then. But suffice to say that before I go into that, that in Wales and in Scotland in particular, the lack of definition didn't really matter, because they went on to produce the Welsh Future Generations Act, which was very much about delivering social value, in 2014. And in Scotland, they introduced the Duty for Sustainable Procurement in the same year. In 2019, the Act was reviewed, and it was acknowledged that those figures I talked about earlier, the 10% threshold, the 10% maximum amount of social value wasn't being observed particularly. Some local authorities were asking up to 20%, and the threshold rule wasn't being particularly observed. But nevertheless, no changes to the actual law were brought in at that time. Since then, the government, in fact, just in the last few months, has changed its own procurement rules to make them much more in favour of acquiring social value. Because where the local authorities were leading, it has to be said that national government and government agencies have been lagging behind over the last 10 years. Lots of warm words about delivering social value, but not much activity. In particular, I remember a pledge made about 5 years ago that the NHS would highlight social value and make it an important part of its procurement processes, and didn't actually seem to produce the massive results we'd like to see from the country's largest procurer of goods and services. Anyway, when we came to write the British Standard 8950 on understanding and enhancing social value, it was pretty important, we thought, that we knew what we were talking about, and therefore that we made a definition of social value. And again, it's quite easy to define what it is not. It is not a list of inputs. You can't define social value by saying we did 1,000 hours of volunteering, or we raised £10,000 for charity. Those are inputs, they're not outputs. And if social value is anything, it's about outcomes and outputs. And secondly, we decided that it wasn't going to be possible to recommend any one single tool for measuring social value. And I'll come back to the measurement issue in just a moment. And we defined social value as being related to human well-being, although, of course, environmental issues are included in that definition of human well-being. And in particular, it was about changes in human well-being, and better still, it was about positive changes in human well-being. So therefore, social value is measured by measuring change. And if you're going to measure change, then you need to have a baseline. You need to know what things were like before you did whatever it is that you're claiming produced social value. And also there's the issue of, beg your pardon, I've just seen somebody coming up in the chat and it rather distracted me. So human being, it's about, oh yes, social value is not an alternative to companies and others making surpluses, making profit. It used to be said that if you were a company, you could either do good or you could make profit, but that situation has really changed over the years, and many companies with high social impact and social value measures do it and find that it actually enhances their commercial viability rather than detracts from it. So just a word, if I may, about the ways of measuring social value. As I said, it's important to start off with a baseline. If you think about it, we measure things all the time. Just behind me here, you can see a doorpost, and lots of family doorposts have measurements on them, how tall the children were at any particular in any particular year. And every Christmas you come along and make a new mark on the door. That is a measurement, and it's a measurement of change. Growing a sunflower over a few weeks, again, something children might be encouraged to do, is also, you measure change, you measure the height of the plant, but you measure on a completely different time scale. And if you're a molecular chemist, you measure things on a completely different time scale again. So the important thing is to measure the social value that you're producing in a very specific way, and measure it on with an established baseline over an appropriate level of time. And one of the sort of political tragedies of recent years, I believe, is the way in which the Sure Start, children's services, children's centres have been allowed to wither on the vine. A fantastic facility for deprived communities and the children of those communities in particular. But we always knew it was going to take 15 years before you could really measure the value of what they were doing, because you wouldn't just see the toddlers passing their GCSEs in a greater level than they would have done previously, but so the theory went, you would also see reduction in crime within those communities because of the impact of the Sure Start. But that doesn't happen with toddlers. It happens because of the investment you make at the beginning. So measuring social value is about measuring change, measuring over an appropriate time scale, and also measuring using suitable units. And I would suggest that of the something like 1,000 known ways of measuring social value, I would strongly recommend that each element of social value that you look at, you measure in its own particular way. There's a huge tendency to want to monetize social value. And of course, if you're saying it's got to be up to or around about 10% of the value of a contract, well, that's measured in money. So you need sometimes to be able to monetize it. But I'm going to just mention two of the established tools that are out there. I'm not going to mention them by name. But one of them says, well, if there's been an input of unskilled volunteering, we'll rank that at £10 an hour. And the other says, well, we'll rate it at £11 an hour. At the end of the day, there isn't a huge difference in the calculation and the so-called value of the social value that you produce. However, if you look at those two tools again and look at the skilled volunteering element, one of them ranks skilled volunteering at £25 an hour, and the other ranks it at £75 an hour, because it's got to include perhaps legal advice that's given pro bono, and so on. Now, if you're then going to be measuring social value, it really makes a difference. If you're going to monetize it, it really makes a difference which tool that you use. But the tool that you use should not determine the value of what you're doing. When I used to be a school teacher, we had a saying, which was, you don't make pigs fatter by measuring them more often. It's appropriate to use the right level of way of measuring, and very often these will be qualitative, very often they will be subjective, but even where they're subjective and qualitative, you've got to take the variance out and have your baseline, your timescale, your units, asking people if they feel happier as a result of an input. That's very, very subjective, but it may be a very valid social value outcome. So for all of those different ways, that was a very quick run through the long history of social value, which now goes back over a decade. And I know that many people who are on the call will have their own experiences of delivering and witnessing social value. Some may even have read and used the BS 8950, and I hope you have found it useful. I'm going to hand back to Christina now, and we're happy between us, once Christina's given her presentation, to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I really appreciate that. And yes, absolutely. Please, I can see one question's popped up already in the chat. Please feel free to put them in there. Don't wait until the end, especially if they're fresh in your mind. And yes, I'll aim to cover the standard quite briefly, and then I'm more than happy to answer more questions on the standard as part of a Q&A, as part of our discussion session as well. So if we could have the first main slide, please. Thank you. So BS 8900, as I mentioned, published a year ago, and I should say, for clarity, especially for those of you who are quite familiar with standards, it is a guidance style standard. So it isn't a requirements-based standard. You can't sort of say, oh, yes, I've achieved this, and for example, certify to it. It's one of BSI's suite of guidance standards, and it also is underpinned by some principles which the drafting panel group really felt was something that was important in the context of social value, given the context and the wider historical background that Tom has just covered. So not only is it a guidance standard, but it is applicable to all type of organizations. And then again, I will expand on this, but it's just to really reiterate that there is the background to the Social Value Act. There is this public procurement sector clearly that really drove this, but social value, in short, is something that all organizations, regardless of what it is that they do, can and hopefully should be looking at. And so why is this? Really, and why was BS 8950 specifically developed? So it was to highlight the link, as you can see from the slide, between social value, business purpose, and the wider sustainability sort of agenda. I mean, the standard itself does define social value as well-being in the short and long term. And well-being is actually defined as the result and purpose of sustainability. So hopefully this really reinforces the fact that social value is just another lens and supports the interconnecting pillars of environmental, social, economic, well, those pillars that do need to be balanced, hopefully when sort of developing kind of good sustainable practices within an organization. And environmental good leads to social value. Similarly, enhancing social value should advance the sustainability practices within an organization. There's a big, again, Tom really did give some nice examples around this and around measurement and about how it's not about inputs. This is all about impacts, and it's about relevant impacts. It's about stakeholder engagement and making sure that the actions that are taken considering the relevant stakeholders and hopefully benefit again, the beneficiaries who and stakeholders who will be impacted by the actions. So there's a really big, strong element around underlining the need for stakeholder engagement. And the standard also brings together various frameworks and approaches that are already in existence outside of this standard, and hopefully sort of underlines that there is quite a lot of coherence around these. And there was a plan to create a sort of a useful tool element to the standard. So it's very useful as a guidance document, but it should also help organizations begin to address this issue internally. So over to the next slide, please. So just building on what I said, the aims of BS 8950 is to really give guidance for the understanding, preservation and enhancement of social value. And that's why the word enhancement, there was a big push to make sure that the word enhancement was in the title, because it was really about kind of really going beyond and striving for sort of really best practice in this area. The standard should help organizations consider and manage, as well as increase, their social value in a more structured way. Start thinking about how they might address social value, regardless of whether they've been involved in it already and have got things going on within their organizations, or actually if they're completely new to the topic. And there's a lot of information here, and this is around the framework, which I will touch upon, around how organizations might start to do that. So how do you start recognizing and identifying things, and how do you start accounting for, and then ultimately down the line reporting on social value? And again, as I touched upon, this is really about aligning quite a lot within an organization. So there's a lot of emphasis around business benefits, and to help organizations understand why this may not just be of relevance to them, but why they should and hopefully would want to be involved and to enhance their own social value, from shifting the emphasis from maximizing financial returns to ESG, an opportunity for impact investing, to other elements, which hopefully you're familiar with, such as, increasing customer and consumer perceptions of the organization as doing good, being a supplier of choice, being an organization that people want to work for. Next slide, please. So how does BS 8950 hope to achieve all of this? Well, it outlines some key principles that help the organization with decision making. Some of those principles include stakeholder input, recognizing social value, materiality, and then some details around quantifying changes in social value and that aspect of change that Tom talked about. Again, building on what I just said, there really is a focus on culture and leadership within an organization, which hopefully links to the business benefits and rationale for wanting to be involved in this space and in these kind of activities. And there is quite a lot of emphasis. Again, I'd say this is the tool element of the standard, around information as to what sort of data you actually need to start collecting to know whether you are, affecting change. And So and it creates, the standard creates a framework for measuring social value, building on and linking to those principles and frameworks. So that and other frameworks. So that framework aspect of the standard, it is based on the planning cycle of Plan, Do, Check, Act, but it's structured broadly around information, data collection, good quality and relevant. Again, it's about making sure that the actions really do take the stakeholders and ultimately the beneficiaries into account. And other aspects of the framework also, well, they do touch upon stakeholders again, reporting aspects and risks. What BS 8950 does not do is tell organizations how to undertake specific social value activities. And it doesn't standardize data for qualifying impact. But it does a whole load of other things, and hopefully it enables, it's really an enabling tool for organizations to begin to address this. So just the final slide very briefly. I believe you will receive copies of these slides, but just some signposting to a free guide to the social value standard, which is a guidance style of standard. So the guide is the document that Tom produced for us, and hopefully again it's something that you may want to read before sort of deciding whether you want to purchase the standard, and hopefully also the blog that's available on our website, which really does again underline the why this might be relevant for your organization. And obviously, hopefully, if you're interested, then this is where you can go and buy the standard. And yes, the guide has also been circulated to you and is available to attendees. So I'll stop there on the standard, because I'm really keen to allow us time to have a general discussion now, and open up to any queries that you may have. I see that there's one question that has come through the chat box. Please feel free to use that tool. I will, and I believe that I have some other hosts and panelists who will help monitor the raise hands, but I can see that, so we can unmute you. And just while you think about some questions, maybe a question to you, which is really, do any of you know whether you're implementing social value within your organizations, or actually, having heard what you've heard today, whether you had thought about it in that sense or not, do you now think, are there any activities that you may be involved in that actually you think may well be social value activities, had you sort of recognized them as such or not? So that's my question to you. If anyone wishes to have a go at coming back to us on that, that would be very welcome, but also happy to answer any questions that you may have. And let's just start with Jada, who and I believe you touched on this actually, Tom, while you were still speaking. Jada says, are there any particular tools or software out there to measure the value of impact, of social value impact or change?
Well, a few years ago, somebody told me that they were doing a master's degree on the measurement of social value, and they had identified over 1,000 different tools that were being used in different ways. Now, some of those tools will be little more than the back of an envelope, and some will be quite massive, quite complex. And I think one should mention at this point TOMS, which is not named after me. The word is an acronym, but it's probably the most widely used tool. But there are, particularly within local authority sector, there are other tools which local authorities have developed for their own purpose. As I said, it is about measuring what's important. It's about materiality. It's about then choosing the right tools to measure. And whilst I was a bit scathing about monetization, and some tools simply seek to monetize activities, nevertheless, there is a place for that. I'm reminded of the original social impact bond, which came out about 2010, and its aim was to discover ways of reducing reoffending in short sentence prisoners, because all the work on reducing reoffending at that time was going on people who were leaving prison after longer sentences. And within 3 years in one city, the aim was to provide an input funded by investors, which would reduce reoffending over the 12 months following people's release from prison by 5%. In fact, over a 3-year period, they averaged 7%. So they not only were able to pay the investors back with, I think it was 3% per year interest on that, but you can see where the cost savings are. But the cost savings were not necessarily in that city. The cost savings were to the police service because crime was reduced. They were to the court service because crime was reduced. But ultimately, the benefits of those cost-cutting effects was the government, the taxpayer, who pays for those services. So that's one of the problems of monetization, that the real value, monetary value, doesn't occur within the organization that's actually delivering the social value. That's why it's important to think what's important and what's relevant.
Thank you, Tom, for those examples, and for confirming what I thought was the case, was that yes, that there are many tools and frameworks out there. Tools and software to measure social value. Richard Jones, great session, thank you. Is there any balance in this standard to avoid any danger that organizations just measure the positives and disregard the negatives? For example, in other areas there have been reference to greenwashing. I know the standard does cover that, doesn't it?
Well, there's one three-letter word which I missed out of my presentation, and it's the word net. I talked about a positive change in social value. I meant, of course, to say a positive net change in social value, because it is important to realize that what the physicists say, to every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. That was Newton. But there's also the law of unintended consequences. And it may well be that there is a price to be paid for changing behavior in a way which enhances social value in one respect, by having a knock-on, even a negative knock-on in other areas. I can't think of a really good example of that at the moment, but certainly we live in a world where businesses in particular have been encouraged to disregard the negatives. You know, if you look at the whole measurement of GDP, for example, it excludes the impact of pollution and resource depletion and so on. So yes, I mean, greenwashing and social value washing are dangers, but I believe that whereas we've had probably 30 years now of some very blatant greenwashing, because of that experience and because the concept of social value is that bit newer, I think people are a little more circumspect and a little less ready to make outrageously beneficial claims and therefore to keep things more realistic.
Thank you. And just one example where I do know that BS 8.9, I do recall the standard does touch upon that need, and it, as Tom correctly said, it's the unintended consequences aspect. So in undertaking sort of as part of the stakeholder engagement aspect, which really is key to the standard, and understanding what is material and to who, i.e. it should be the person affected or those experiencing the impacts. And actually it's you may well be impacting somebody positively now, but it's taking into, and the standard does give this an example, does take sort of further down the line. So whether you're talking about down the supply chain or from a sort of a time perspective, so making sure that we're not negatively impacting future generations, for example, in a consideration that is beneficial at the moment. So that's a nice example of the unintended consequences for the stakeholders that I recall from the standard. We have another question from Emma Sexton. Social value is not currently a focus of our company. I'm the environmental administrator for the company, and as such have become aware of social value need within businesses. As a relatively small engineering company, I would say I'm still unsure where we can start to integrate this into the work I currently do. I'm hoping the standard will assist with this. Thanks, Emma. Yes, well, very briefly from me, one of my aims for this session, one of our aims for this session was to really inform and make sure that this session was really around, raising awareness of social value. And then as another benefit, obviously, promoting BS 8950 as a way for organizations to start addressing this and looking at how they might be able to start getting involved in this space within their organizations. I mean, that really was the purpose of BS 8950, and I do encourage you to, if you like, to first and foremost take a look at the guide and take a look at the blog, and then hopefully those will underpin further what's been said today in terms of how it might help you as an organization. I don't know if you have any other comments on that, Tom, because I was actually going to ask back to you, which was, really this space around how organizations that aren't involved in public procurement and really trying to get them to understand that this is something that is of relevance and more so, despite the fact that there's so many other things going on in the sort of sustainability space, how there really is a role for social value.
Yes, I think that where private businesses first became aware of social value was those who were submitting tenders to local authorities, and suddenly found that some local authorities were asking questions that weren't normally being asked in tender processes. Normally you're asked, can you deliver it and at what price? But other questions started to come into the discussions as well. Now, it sounds like Emma's company is perhaps not directly supplying local authorities, or at least not local authorities that are utilising social value. But 5 years after the Social Value Act first was tabled in Parliament, we of course got the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and we make several references in the standard to aligning with the sort of broad definitions of social value, which a lot of those, and if you include in full the environmental aspects as well, because they say that they are virtually indistinguishable, or virtually inseparable, let's put it that way, then a lot of companies are now using the Sustainable Development Goals as a pattern. And I do think that the standard does help to ally those and bring them together. What I will say to you, Emma, is if you look at your own procurement issues, you look at your own supply chains, you wonder what the reputational impact on your company would be if everything that was going on in your supply chain suddenly became public. Now, I'm not saying it may be that you don't know what's going on in your supply chain, but one of the things that social value does encourage is for companies to be very much aware of where and how their supplies are coming from. Where, again, since the Act, we've also had the Modern Slavery Act, and that very much on the social value agenda, but it also says to companies, modern slavery isn't something that happens in far distant countries. It actually happens in your supply chains. So there's one example. But I might be opening the floodgates here, but if Emma wanted to contact with me just for a one-to-one chat about, so I could understand her situation better, I'd be very happy to respond by email or whatever.
Thank you, Tom. I can see we have 4 minutes left, so that's fine. Richard, are there any estimates of how many organizations are using this standard, please? That's a difficult question to answer because we do have information as to who's purchased the standard, but it is an ongoing process as to the sort of user experience and feedback with regards to that, and something that we do try and undertake. And actually, I'm just going to drop my work email address into the chat, although I just realized I sent it to just the host and panelists. So this is really me saying, if I'm always keen to receive feedback as to how people are finding the standard. So please feel free to do that should you decide to use it, or should you know anyone else who is. So I'll just drop my email in the chat now. Do you think this standard could help expedite an EU social taxonomy for investors? If we can do that in 1 minute, Tom?
Right. Well, there has so much work has gone into impact investing and the development of this new field of economics over the years. And I know that there's a lot of work going on at the moment about the various standards and memorandums of understanding and guides that exist to impact investing, both at EU level and indeed OECD level as well, with the aim of trying to reduce the number of different guides that there are to impact investing. But what companies who take up impact investing do, or take up social value do, is they find the benefits to their company are not just immediately on the bottom line and giving them a warm glow in their heart. Social value can actually increase the sense of purpose amongst employees. It can increase employee retention. It can increase employee satisfaction. And for all of those reasons, making people think that coming to work, making people properly and legitimately think that coming to work is actually there for the greater good as well, and not just for their for the profit-seeking owners of their company, is a huge benefit for companies to acquire, and social value can help them do that.
Thank you, Tom. I can see that we have had one last question come through from Jada. I'm not sure whether we suddenly cut short at 15. So maybe, Jada, if you could drop me a line on my email, christina.allen@bsigroup.com, I'll make sure that answered the question.
Could I just say on that?
Yes.
Some of the construction companies are amongst the best practitioners of social value, and some have even developed their own frameworks for operating. So I'm very pleased to see what Jade says, but not actually very surprised.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your feedback. It's been a pleasure, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you, Tom.
My pleasure.
Bye, everyone.